The idea of one-sidedness can help us debunk a few more misconceptions. How do books get banned? Certainly not because they offend the average person. Most persons are passive and don't really care, or don't care enough to request the banning. From past episodes, it looks like all it takes is a few motivated activists for the banning of some books or the blacklisting of some people. The great philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell lost his job at the City University of New York owing to a letter by an angry and stubborn mother who did not wish to have her daughter in the same room as the fellow with a dissolute lifestyle and unruly ideas. The same seems to apply to prohibitions, at least to the prohibition of alcohol in the United States, which led to interesting mafia stories. Let us conjecture that the formation of moral values in society does not come from the evolution of the consensus. No, it is the most intolerant person who imposes virtue on others precisely because of that intolerance. The same can apply to civil rights. This is an excerpt from page 83 of Skin in the Game by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, whose writings have made a number of appearances on this show and perhaps conversations similar. And the title of episode 77, if you did not read it while clicking or opening it up, is Gaslighting Gun Control. Now, if this were to be an overtly political conversation, I think we would start by talking about which constituents and advocates are arguing for which forms of control and which forms of governing bodies. But what the intent of this episode is to accomplish is to provide a data point and an argument for you, the listener, because it is my thesis that we as American individuals are more than well equipped physically for the defense of our rights. But where we have fallen short, perhaps by our intent and perhaps by others, is the intellectual tools. We have been sort of disarmed and defanged already by means of anti education. And so I start with the word gaslighting because of its relevance in contemporary language. But before we get any further, I wanted to make sure that if you are listening or watching, that you're aware that we are running a pre-order on some of our shirts right now. This show is actually supported by the store purchases that you are making, as well as a membership at redactedculture.locals.com. This is how we keep this show rolling. The shirt that I'm wearing right now is a black printed on black subdued edition of our classic redacted tee. It is visible in the daylight, but even better under night vision. The new version, just in time for summer, is a white base with black text, and that is called the Inverted. You can find those both at redactedllc.com. Now, business aside, let's get back to gaslighting. The term gaslighting has had relevance in the modern milieu, especially in the West, in the last 2 to 3 years. Perhaps it saw its peak during the highlight of the COVID crisis, if you want to call it that. But during the highlight of that time, and the term gaslighting came to mean a couple of things to a couple of different people. But to shorten the definition of gaslighting for the use of this conversation, the objective of gaslighting is not so much to win you over to my idea by the strength of my arguments, but rather by challenging your own confidence in your own sanity, in the information that you see, in the material that you read. In other words, gaslighting is not here to win you over to my side by the strength and integrity of my ideas and my arguments. It's rather to sort of bully you into accepting my worldview by simply negating your own. Now, it gets even more thorough and more specific when we look at the history of how the word came to pass. But effectively, what gaslighting does is it lies to you but with an added hook of always telling you that your own senses can't be trusted. There's a problem with this, however, because what happens if the person you're talking to is wrong? And why this applies to gun culture as a whole is because I think you can say with a certain amount of cogency that The American population over the last 3 generations since World War II has been gaslit into believing things that are counterfactual about their rights. A most classic example that continues to arise over and over and over again is that the Second Amendment didn't include things like AR-15s or weapons of war. And what it's trying to do is whether it's intended or unintended, what it accomplishes is it tries to challenge your understanding of the rules and beliefs of the people who founded this country and whether or not they are legitimate. Now, in a formal argument, this would make sense. I would want to attack a point that you have out of respect to challenge the legitimacy of that point in order to provide a avenue for somebody for you to come under sway by what I am arguing instead. And this follows under the Western tradition, this very Western idea of the battleground of ideas, that we are going to engage in the conflict of concepts and thought life before we're going to engage in the literal battlefield on the ground. And this time and place or the trajectory of this heritage does make a lot of sense throughout the Western world. However, it has also always existed in tandem with very physical wars and very, very physical conflicts. So perhaps, and perhaps more specifically after the advent of the nuclear bomb, but for perhaps even more specifically as technology has allowed and provided more opportunities for individuals to, on the negative side, become more atomized, and on the positive side, become slightly more independent from their, let's just say, controlling institutions. What it has also produced is it challenges the legitimacy of this battleground of ideas at all, because in a real and perfect world of the academies or of the intellect, people would simply yield to better arguments when faced with them. But what this means for us within the gun world is that it allows us, it provides an avenue by which we can understand a rather important difference between making a convincing argument in order to sway somebody over, a difference between that, a good argument for the intent of convincing an interlocutor or someone you're in conversation with, and the foundation by which you believe in what you believe. Let me explain. So when I say that let's just say the American population or the West or gun culture has been um, malnourished when it comes to ideas, what I mean is that when we are challenged by things, or no, I'm sorry, what I mean is that while we may believe that we are right in what we are advocating for, individual liberty, individual responsibility, self-determination, self-defense, what ends up happening is that our shortness of, that's not even shortness of, the fact that we are not even thoroughly convinced ourselves in certain senses is used against us. An accusation is brought up against you, forcing you to think about why you believe what you want to, what you believe. And that position, that action would be correct in a conversation with honest interlocutors. But we're not dealing always with honest interlocutors. A case in point example of this would be in 2012 into 2013, after the tragedy of Sandy Hook, many people came out and started spouting out these not true facts about guns. That's the only other way, very easily falsified information about, let's just say, the use of weapons in crime or tragedies or the capabilities of items themselves. And they were very quickly, very quickly trounced by the internet. In the famous words of Thomas Massey just last year, the internet will correct you. Well, what happens is, and why I think this is an important subject, is because we may be committed in some sense to what we believe in the rights of the individual, in liberty, in the pursuit of happiness or the pursuit of property, but the foundation upon which those beliefs are settled has not been properly built over the last couple generations. In our current world right now, the NRA is not looked at very highly. And while we may be looking at somewhat of a pendulum effect where they've come out of popularity with even their general population, or maybe it is simply a generational turnover where new, younger blood has to take the fight up themselves, one of the challenges that the NRA, one of the things that the NRA fell short on when it came to gun culture was educating the individual on the things that are right and true and good. They would make an argument something that might be true, like that they're coming to take your guns or something like that. We're here to defend the Second Amendment. But that defense was in some ways expected to be exported, not exported, what's the word? Abdicated to somebody else. In other words, don't defend your own ideas with your own intellect. Let us do it for you. And I don't believe that that's the way that we will be able to survive going forward. Every single person who lives within our gun control world will have to come face to face with what they believe and why they believe it. And so the objective here is actually to give you certain tools and certain foundational ideas that inform your right to inform you of your right to self-defense and self-determination in this regard. Why I use the word gaslighting is that the primary strategy that I believe is used against you is to make you doubt that you did the right thing. And when it comes to an easy example of this, an easy example of this is any time that there is some form of tragedy that reaches the national political news sphere, immediately, immediately, if not before it even hits there, the accusation comes as if you were somehow responsible. That you, the individual who is looking out for the well being of yourself and your family, has some sort of corporate guilt, collective guilt is probably the better way of saying it, collective guilt for the actions of somebody you had no interaction with, no community with, no conversation with. You had no influence in their life whatsoever. In fact, before they decided to go commit an atrocity, you had no idea they even existed. But you're gaslit into believing that you're somehow responsible for this person's actions, whether it's because they were bullied, whether it's because they were a minority of some sort, whether it was because they were not a minority, but they're just like you in the way that they look, because that's the level of ethics that we evaluate people. That's a hard question mark. Or because somehow that the fact that you believe that you have a right to own a gun and you exercise that right by the possession of arms for the defense of your family and your participation and responsibility to your community, you're somehow responsible for somebody else's community well off over there that you had no interaction or participation in. And so the gaslighting is trying to make you doubt that you even believe that, or that your beliefs in your right to self defense are even legitimate, as if the cost of life, the cost and the risk was somehow your responsibility because you chose to accept the responsibility where they chose not to. This is how I'm going to explain it. And this is just going to be a single data point that I would appreciate if you share with other people. Not a data point, an argument. Um, so, why we believe that we have the right to bear arms is not out of some sort of circumstantial evidence that comes about by the presence of dictators or the potentiality of a threat in our environment, or the idea simply that we could at some point in time undergo some sort of harrowing circumstance where the ability to defend our lives would be dependent on the possession of arms. That is not specifically why we believe that an individual, a citizen of the United States, has the right to bear arms. The reason why we believe in it is because we believe that it is a human right. That the very idea that one group of people could get together in a room, write some things on a piece of paper, or vote or come to vote about something would have some form of deterministic effect over your individual rights is antithetical to what we believe to be true. If you're a human being and I'm a human being, we are both human beings. And one element of both being human beings, is that I do not have, or I will be infringing upon your rights if I am inhibiting or containing your expression of those rights within an environment that doesn't infringe on my own. And so the counter argument might come across something like, your right to own a gun does not overcome my right to safety. I hate to cut it to you, but there is no such thing as a right to safety. There's just no thing. That's the gaslighting. That specifically is the gaslighting because the language that's being used is appealing to your concern for your well-being and responsibility and future in this world, as if that was somehow jeopardizing somebody else's right to exist, as if the mere existence of the potentiality of you using a tool for self-defense would be considered the infringement of somebody's arbitrary feeling of safety. Now, that's an accusation. But we're going back to the argument that is for you and I, you the listener, me the speaker in this case, to talk about why and how we believe that right or why it exists, how it exists, and what that foundation is. And that foundation is in you are a human being. You have inherent value as an individual that is not determined by utility or the state. And part of that value also includes a right to self determination to some extent, where you get to make choices and deal with the consequences of those choices. And those consequences are best ordered in the world when they align with reality, when they are non arbitrary, when they have a correlation to the world. So, you being in possession of an arm is not a threat to a person unless they have the intent on infringing upon your right. Now, that can be extrapolated a little too far, a little too quickly, as in, well, anyone who wants you to not have a gun is probably also plotting to harm you. Do not go down that road. That's a fallacy. That is a fallacy of, it's not like equivocation. Would it be equivocation fallacy? Whatever. It's a fallacy in the grounds that you are saying that just because it is possible that somebody might not desire to disarm you because they intend to do you harm, means that the only reason why someone would desire to disarm you is because they intend to do you harm. That's the fallacy. Although there certainly are people who fit that bill, and we shouldn't lie to ourselves in that regard. But moving forward, the next piece of information, the next thing that is for your edification, is that when I say this, let me say it sufficiently. It is not right for you to have to ask for permission to do something you have a right for. And while we may see this as a utilitarian, I'm sorry, not utilitarian, perhaps a utopian ideal in the long run, what it means is it helps us orient our pursuits in pursuit of an ideal. That we want to limit arbitrary barriers to entry over your rights, let's just say, because they're not really barriers to entry over your rights, but we want to limit or prohibit arbitrary government or human-made prohibitions to your rights. You don't need a membership. You shouldn't need a what is it called? You should not need to. It should not be required, and this doesn't mean that this is the case legally, but we will say within a moral framework, I should not be required to appeal to somebody who has no correlation to my circumstance as to whether or not I may provide for my family and well-being. That is the argument that's being made. I do not need to appeal to somebody who has no correlation, that I had no voluntary participation in, for the permission to exert my human rights. And so the gaslighting that happens here, I'm going to, as we reiterate, the gaslight that happens here is that for some reason, And I don't think it's entirely an amoral one. I think it might actually be an immoral. Amoral meaning absent morality, immoral being immoral as in not moral or anti-moral or wrong, bad, evil. I think there is some intent of probably best phrased as resentment or Nietzschean ressentiment against the capable by the people who claim incapability. Now, we really know that they're capable, but fine. I think that has a stronger standpoint, but it doesn't do me it doesn't really do me all that good to thoroughly and effectively continue to diagnose my opposition. Instead, what we're really here in the pursuit of the mind is the pursuit of truth. Now, so now what that means then, and what we're arguing for, is that your right to self-defense is actually, if we actually believe that it is a God-given right, or it is your right by your inherent right by being a human being, then what we should be doing is looking to push that right, codifying it deeper and further into the United States, so that when you advocate for some form of the repealing of gun control, you might be called all the evil names in the book, but you are right. You are right in that action. So this is your encouragement. Go forth and go forth and further that truth throughout our system. Go forth and participate in your community, engage in your church, live in your environment, participate in your what are in the things that are within your reach. I made that comment. I started with the comment from Skin in the Game by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. That was the opening statement for this segment from Skin in the Game. And the argument that was being made there, and that he is making, again, this is page 83, it's a book worth reading for sure, is that in some ways, the formation of the moral values that are held in society are not simply determined democratically, but by the people who retain those consistently through their society, that they further that as a truth. It is no longer good enough to be passive and reactive to the movement of our country or our world. We should be advocating, pushing, and moving forward the needle. There's been a long complaint that exists within the gun world that is, every time there's a controversy, we lose ground. Comically enough, I've heard this said on the other end, but whatever. But there's this argument that said, every time this stuff comes up, we lose ground. And the answer is, yeah, probably. I think we can make a very clear case that we haven't exactly been winning since the NFA. But if we do not truly believe in our right to bear arms, if we're allowing ourselves to be gaslit into thinking that some sort of capricious, arbitrary pursuit of generic aesthetics or some garbage idea like that, if that our desire for self-preservation is actually malice, if we're allowing ourselves on the cultural level to be gaslit on that area, how do we expect to represent that in our supposedly duly elected government? So that being the case, if this is one thing that has been useful to you, if you believe that we are gaining something, if that gun culture or America is actually moving steadily towards decentralization in a good way, it doesn't have to be pure balkanization, it doesn't have to be civil war, but we're seeing decentralization on the level of the individual, where we are choosing voluntarily to participate in our communities instead of, just further atomizing. If you're seeing that this trend that through technology and the contemporary environment is simultaneously under the threat of a centralized authoritarian government and a rapid decentralization, my argument to you is, let's be part of this community together. Let's build, let's live together. Let's pursue righteousness together. Let's pursue what is right and true and good. And one example of that would be privacy. If you are if you have any sort of ability to reach out to your constituents and you want to participate in the political system that is the United States, remember, privacy is a human right. The fact that the government has no that the fact that you have a right to privacy should prohibit the government from requiring permission for you to defend your life. This doesn't mean that there isn't an ethical question involved. You must do it rightly. This is not an excuse for bad behavior, but go ahead, go forth. This is your encouragement. Push, charge, you lead the way. We got you. This is the Redacted Culture Cast. This has been episode 77, Gaslighting Gun Control, and we will see you soon.